The clock in the cockpit read 23:40. Hidden in the darkness of Meuire Field, Major Carroll C. Smith sat coiled in the cramped seat of his P-61 Black Widow. Beside him, the radar operator's face was washed in a faint, green glow as he tracked a ghost. A Japanese contact slicing through the Philippine night at 180 knots. At 26, Smith was a veteran of 43 missions with 4 kills painted on his fuselage, but the air over Muro felt heavier tonight. The stakes were simple but massive. For 2 weeks, the Japanese had hammered Muro with relentless precision, 334 air raid alerts in just 14 days. They knew that if the American engineers finished those 2 runways, the upcoming Lingian Gulf invasion would have total air cover. To stop that, the Japanese sent everything they had: conventional bombers, kamikazes, and flying crates of high explosives. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had only been on the ground for 3 days. Now, Smith and his crew were the thin line of defense protecting 20,000 American troops vulnerable in their tents below. One slip-up meant a delayed invasion and a mounting body count. Smith felt the vibration of his twin Pratt and Whitney engines, 4,000 combined horsepower ready to scream. The Black Widow was a Predator built for this specific pitch-black hell, boasting a 66-foot wingspan and a lethal quartet of 20 cannons tucked in its belly. But as Smith stared into the void, he knew his deadliest advantage wasn't the guns. It was the invisible eye of the radar. The secret sat bolted into the nose, the SC-720 radar. In an era where the Japanese counted on the night to act as an impenetrable cloak, this technology turned the darkness into a glass house. They flew with a false sense of security, unaware that an invisible beam was already painting their fuselages from 5 miles out. In the compartment behind Smith, Lieutenant Philip Porter, a man who had spent 6 months mastering the flickers and ghosts of a cathode ray tube, watched the glowing scope. Porter was the navigator of this void, the man who could whisper a heading into Smith's ear and guide a heavy fighter to a target he couldn't even see. But as the green light flickered, the math turned cold and lethal. 1 P-61, 12 bombers. The logic of the sky was unforgiving. If Smith committed to a single dogfight, 11 other crews would continue their run, raining high explosives onto the sleeping men below. Even a successful mission, dropping 3 or 4 enemies, meant failure for the troops on the ground. Every second spent in a pursuit was a second. The invasion clock ticked backward. Smith's mind flashed back to the grueling months at Orlando Army Airfield. He had been forged in the darkness, trained to fly without a horizon and kill without a silhouette. He had moved from the primitive P-70 Havocs to the experimental P-38s, finally graduating to this, the Black Widow. It was the first true night hunter, stable, powerful, and precise. Yet as the engines hummed, the reality of the fuel gauge and the clock set in. 3 hours of fuel, 12 targets. If he played by the book, 9 bombers would make it to Muro. To save the airfield, Smith couldn't just be a pilot tonight. He had to be a ghost. 9 bombers represented more than just a failure of statistics. They represented a catastrophe. If those payloads found the fuel dumps or the ammunition crates, the casualties wouldn't be counted in hundreds, but in thousands. At 23:42, the silence in Smith's headset died. Porter's voice, sharp and professional, cut through the static. He had 4 distinct signatures on the glass, scattered across different altitudes but all screaming south toward Muro. Smith was at a crossroads. Attempt a standard intercept or execute a plan that bordered on suicidal genius. He didn't hesitate. He jammed the throttles forward, feeling the 4,000 horsepower kick him into the seat as the Black Widow began a relentless 2,000 foot per minute climb. Heading 35, altitude 8,000, range 4 miles, Porter commanded. Outside the canopy, the world was a void. A thick blanket of clouds had swallowed the moon and stars, creating the exact conditions the Japanese high command prayed for. They believed the darkness made them ghosts. They didn't know Smith was flying a machine that could see through the soul of the night. The SCRM-720 in the nose was working overtime, its parabolic dish sweeping the sky with microwave pulses. In the back, Porter was performing a high-speed mental dance, monitoring two separate displays, one for the target's horizontal bearing, the other for its altitude. "Left 5, down 3, Porter whispered, his verbal corrections acting as Smith's only tether to reality. At 3 miles out, Smith's own cockpit display flickered to life. While simpler than Porter's array, this integrated scope gave Smith the autonomy he needed for the final approach. He no longer needed a voice in his ear. He had the Predator's instinct in his eyes. The target was a Mitsubishi G4 Million, the Betty. It was a fast, capable bomber, but it carried a fatal flaw. Its fuel tanks weren't self-sealing. It was a flying tinderbox. At 2 miles, the glowing blip on Smith's scope was steady. The distance was closing. The Hunter had found its first mark. The second bomber was moving away from Smith, heading directly for the airfields. The P-61 was faster, but not by much. If Smith stayed level, the chase would last 20 minutes. That was 20 minutes he didn't have. He used the only advantage he had left: gravity. He pushed the nose down, trading altitude for a burst of speed that pushed the Black Widow past 340 mph. Porter's voice was the only thing connecting Smith to the target. "Range 2 miles. He's turning, Smith. Leveling off at 5,000 feet." The Japanese pilot was beginning his bomb run. Smith could see the Muro airfields in the distance. The searchlights were active now, sweeping the sky in desperate arcs, but they couldn't find the Betty. The ground crews were firing blind, the anti-aircraft tracers arching thousands of feet below Smith's position. Smith closed to 600 yards. This time, he didn't wait for a visual. He trusted the radar return on his cockpit scope. He adjusted the trim, stabilized the airframe, and waited until the blip sat perfectly centered. At 400 yards, the silhouette finally appeared, another Betty. He didn't go for the wing this time. He aimed for the fuselage, hoping to ignite the bomb load before it could be released. He gave it a 3-second burst. The 20 shells hammered into the bomber's spine. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a massive secondary explosion turned the night into day. The Betty's bomb rack had detonated. The shockwave slammed into the P-61, tossing the heavy fighter like a leaf. Smith fought the controls, leveling the wings as the wreckage of the second bomber rained down into the jungle below. Time, 22. 2 down, 10 remaining. But the radar was showing something new. The remaining bombers weren't staying in their individual lanes anymore. They were converging. Porter identified 3 separate blips only 2 miles apart. They were forming a concentrated strike group. Smith had to decide: engage the group and risk being overwhelmed by defensive fire, or try to pick them off one by one while the airfield burned. The distance between the first kill and the next target was 23 miles. At a standard cruise of 280 mph, that gap would take 5 minutes to close. 5 minutes the Japanese pilot would spend drawing a bead on Muro. Smith couldn't afford the wait. He pushed the throttles until the Black Widow hit 320 mph, knowing the ART-28-0 engines were now gulping fuel. Every minute spent at this speed sacrificed 3 minutes of his remaining patrol time, but the alternative was letting the bomber reach the American lines. If the bomber made it to the target zone, the ground-based anti-aircraft batteries would open up. Whether they hit the target or not, the chaos of the barrage and the potential for dropped bombs meant Smith's mission had failed. The reality of night fighting was a game of impossible odds. The Pacific sky was an endless void. Even with the best radar, finding a single enemy required flawless teamwork. Most crews went months without a single contact. Since arriving in the Pacific 14 months prior, the entire 418th Night Fighter Squadron had only recorded 18 kills. Smith already held 4 of those. Doubling his tally in a single night would make him the premier American night fighter ace of the war, But he wasn't thinking about the history books. He was thinking about the men in the tents below. Porter's voice guided him through the final vectors. The second blip sharpened on the glass. 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. At 1 mile, Smith caught the silhouette. It was another Betty, flying lower than the first at 6,000 feet, hugging the cloud layer. The low altitude robbed Smith of his maneuvering room. He had to be surgical. If he came in too hot, he'd overshoot and end up in front of the bomber's guns. Too slow, and he'd lose the element of surprise. In the dark, once a bomber crew knew they were being hunted, they would dive, weave, and fill the air with defensive fire. At 500 yards, the Betty solidified into a dark mass against the charcoal sky. Smith held his breath, keeping the P-61 steady as he closed in for the strike. The bomber crew remained oblivious, flying straight and level as the P-61 stalked them from the shadows. The Widow's matte black finish and relatively quiet engines made it a ghost in the midnight sky. Smith stabilized the airframe, centered the silhouette in his glowing reticle, and at 350 yards he squeezed the trigger. The 2-second burst was devastating. 48 high-explosive shells shredded the Betty's fuselage. First the right engine ignited, then the left, until the entire aircraft was a screaming funeral pyre. It rolled over and plunged into the sea at 19. 2 down, 10 to go. Smith's eyes darted to the fuel gauge. 42% remaining. The math was getting tighter. Porter called out 2 more signatures on the scope, but they presented a tactical nightmare. They were 8 miles apart and separated by 5,000 feet of altitude. One sat at 9,000 feet, the other at 4,000. Smith chose the high road. Climbing was more fuel efficient than a frantic dive followed by a heavy ascent, but it was a gamble. By chasing the northern target, he was giving the lower bomber a clear run at the airfield. If his timing was off by even a minute, his perfect record for the night would be shattered by the sound of exploding American hangars. By 23, the P-61 had clawed its way to 9,000 feet. Porter locked the third contact, 7 miles out, doing 190 knots. But as Smith closed the distance, the blip on the radar began to dance. This pilot wasn't flying a straight line. He was banking, weaving, and shifting his altitude. This wasn't another unsuspecting Betty. The crew knew a predator was in the vicinity. The target was a Nakajima Kiminus 49 Helen. It was a different beast entirely, faster than the Betty with a top speed of 306 mph and bristling with defensive guns. Most dangerous was the tail gunner, who sat behind a 7.7 machine gun with a wide, unobstructed view of the very killing slot Smith needed to occupy. The hunter had finally found an enemy that was looking back. To avoid the tail gunner's line of fire, Smith abandoned a direct approach. He banked the P-61, slipping underneath and to the left of the Helen to exploit the lack of ventral defense common in Japanese aircraft. As the distance closed to 1 mile, the enemy pilot, clearly a veteran, began a series of desperate, erratic maneuvers. He banked sharply and jerked the aircraft through 500-foot altitude shifts, trying to break the invisible tether of the radar. Porter, however, remained locked on, reading the rhythm of the pilot's panic and predicting the next turn. Smith closed the gap to 600 yards. When the Helen snapped into a hard right-hand bank, the Black Widow followed with a precision afforded by its twin-boom stability. Smith kept the reticle glued to the bomber's silhouette as the range dropped. 450 yards, 400 yards. At 375 yards, the night exploded in tracers. The tail gunner had spotted the Widow's shadow and opened fire. With the element of surprise gone, Smith had only a heartbeat to strike before the bomber broke away completely. He hammered the trigger, unleashing a 3-second torrent of 72 rounds. The 20 shells shredded the Helen's fuselage and detonated the right engine. The bomber rolled onto its back and spiraled toward the sea, a pillar of flame in the void. Smith veered away to avoid the cloud of debris. At 29, the third kill was confirmed, But the victory was shadowed by the instrument panel, 28% fuel. He had dropped below the standard 30% safety margin. In the pitch-black Pacific theater, 28% was a gamble with death. Without a horizon to provide perspective, a pilot running on empty wouldn't even know he was falling until the propellers hit the waves. Despite the risk, Porter called out the final target, the low-altitude bomber Smith had bypassed earlier, now just 9 miles away and closing on the troops at Muro. The target was now only 12 miles from Muro. From the cockpit, Smith could see the long, pale fingers of American searchlights probing the clouds, while below them, anti-aircraft crews sat with their fingers on the triggers. Smith pushed the nose down, using the descent to conserve his dwindling fuel. The Black Widow dropped through the altitudes, 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, until he leveled out at 42,000 feet. By holding this slight altitude advantage, he could dive on the enemy, using gravity to slash the time the bomber had to react. The range closed rapidly, 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. At 1 mile, the silhouette materialized. It was another Betty. The bomber was flying a straight, unwavering line toward the airfields. Whether the pilot was oblivious to the night fighters or simply accepted death as the price of his mission, he didn't flinch. Smith slipped into his familiar hunting position, low and behind at 350 yards. He glanced at his ammunition counter, 512 rounds. It was plenty for a fight, but his fuel gauge was a different story. At 23%, he was well past the point of no return. He had exactly one chance. If he missed this burst, he wouldn't have the fuel to circle back for a second attempt. He would have to break off and leave the bomber to its target. At 34, Smith squeezed the trigger. The 2-second burst was surgical. 48-20 shells hammered into the Betty's center fuselage. The force of the impact was so violent that the port wing snapped clean off the airframe. Ignited fuel turned the wreckage into a tumbling torch that hit the water a minute later. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. Smith banked the P-61 toward Muro, his mind immediately pivoting to the next life-or-death calculation. His fuel sat at 21%. Meuire Field was 18 miles to the south. At a steady cruise, the Black Widow burned roughly 100 gallons per hour, and Smith estimated he had about 60 gallons left in the tanks. On paper, he had 36 minutes of flight time, enough to make the runway, provided the night didn't have any more surprises waiting for him. Porter's eyes remained glued to the radar, searching the void for the rest of the strike force. The scope was clear. The other 8 Japanese bombers had turned back, their nerve broken by the invisible predator stalking their formation. The airfields were safe, the construction crews were still at work, and the invasion timeline was secure. But as Smith turned for home at 42, a new ghost appeared on the glass. The contact was 4 miles out, heading north at 7,000 feet, directly between Smith and his base. Smith checked his gauges, 19% fuel, 12 miles from the runway. If he engaged, he was gambling with the last of his reserves. But the logic of the mission was absolute. If a 5th aircraft slipped through and killed American troops, his 4 previous kills would be a hollow victory. He refused to prioritize his own safety over the men on the ground. Smith banked the P-61 toward the intruder. As the range dropped to 800 yards, the silhouette came into focus. This wasn't a lumbering bomber. It was a Nakajima Kimenis 84 Hade, known to the Americans as the Frank. The Frank was a lethal adversary, a high-performance fighter capable of 392 mph, bristling with machine guns and 20 cannons. In the light of day, it could outclimb and outturn a Black Widow with ease. But in the pitch black of the Philippine night, the Frank was toothless. Its pilot was flying blind, searching for targets with his own eyes while Smith watched him through the electronic eye of the SC-720. Smith slipped into the killing slot, below and behind at 500 yards. The maneuver was the same as before, but the target was far more dangerous. The Frank was small, agile, and armored around the cockpit and engine. A short 2-second burst might not be enough to bring it down. Smith closed to 300 yards. His fuel had dropped to 17%. This was his final roll of the dice. If he missed, there was no second chance. He would have to break off immediately and pray his engines didn't cough before he found the runway. Worse, a miss would alert the Frank pilot, turning a surgical strike into a high-stakes dogfight that the P-61 couldn't afford to win. Allowing the Frank to escape would only make future intercepts more dangerous, as the Japanese would adapt to the presence of American night fighters. Smith centered the high-performance fighter in his reticle, his finger hovering over the trigger. He knew the cost. This engagement would drop his fuel to 15%, well below the absolute safety margin. But the alternative, risking the lives of the men at Muro, wasn't an option. At 45, Smith committed. He squeezed the trigger for a 3-second burst, sending 72 rounds into the darkness. The shells shredded the Frank's tail and hammered into the engine cowling. Within seconds, the fighter was a torch trailing thick black smoke as it plummeted. Smith tracked the descent until, at 3,000 feet, a white silk canopy blossomed against the void. The pilot had punched out. The Frank struck the water a minute later. 5 kills, 1 night. Smith's focus immediately shifted to his own survival. His fuel sat at 15%, the engagement having been costlier than he'd hoped. Meuire Field was 11 miles south, giving him roughly 22 minutes of airtime. In the unpredictable Pacific air, any sudden headwind or a slight navigational slip would mean the engines would go silent before he reached the coast. Porter used the radar to paint the shoreline, guiding Smith toward the southwestern coast of the island. Meuire was a primitive strip, operational for only 4 days and devoid of modern landing aids. No instrument systems, no high-intensity beacons, just a single row of kerosene lamps. From 5 miles out, they were nothing more than flickering amber pinpricks in an ocean of black. At 52, Smith leveled off at 2,000 feet, his fuel now at 13%, roughly 84 gallons. He was 8 miles out, traveling at 280 mph. He had 18 minutes of fuel for a flight that would take less than 2, but the margin for error had vanished. The runway was 5,000 feet of crushed coral, carved out by engineers just days prior. It lacked the luxuries of a permanent base. There were no crash barriers and no room for an overrun. Smith had to stick the landing perfectly. If he came in too hot or too slow on the coral surface, the heavy Black Widow would become a 15-ton wreck. In the pitch black of the Pacific, a landing error wasn't just a mistake, it was a death sentence. Smith entered the pattern at 1,000 feet, his fuel dwindling to 11%. The math was getting uglier. The constant throttle adjustments required for the approach were draining the remaining 57 gallons faster than a steady cruise. He estimated 12 minutes of life left in the engines. Then, at 55, the nightmare scenario became a reality. Every single one of the 12 kerosene lamps on the strip went out at once. Total blackout. Smith was 3 miles out, hanging at 800 feet and 140 knots. Without those lights, he was flying into a void. He had no way to judge his height or his alignment with the coral strip. Porter immediately called out the only lifeline they had, the radar altimeter. By bouncing radio waves off the ground, they could track their height with 50-foot accuracy. It was a blind man's landing, descending until the gauge hit 0 and praying they were over the runway and not the jungle. The fuel gauge flickered to 9%. With only 8 minutes of airtime left, there was no plan B. The nearest alternate field at Tacloban was 90 miles away. He'd fall into the sea 40 miles short of the runway. He had to land at Meuire now, or ditch in the waves, and hope the current didn't take him. Smith refused to let the most successful night in the history of the 418th, 5 kills in under an hour, end in a heap of scrap metal because of a few extinguished lamps. He banked the Black Widow toward the coordinates where he remembered the runway sat. 600 feet, fuel at 9%. The world below was an inkwell. He dropped to 400 feet, his eyes locked on the radar altimeter as it chirped 380 feet AGL. He throttled back, bleeding his speed down to 120 knots. With the flaps fully extended, the P-61 would stall at 95, giving him a narrow window of control. He was flying on raw nerves and radio waves, searching for a runway he could no longer see. Maintaining a speed of 120 knots gave Smith a thin 25-knot safety margin. Not much, but every extra second spent in the air was fuel he didn't have. Porter kept his eyes glued to the radar scope, watching the Muro coastline slide by. The field lay just 1 mile inland. Using only his compass and dead reckoning, Smith banked the heavy fighter to a heading of 180 degrees. If his math was perfect, the coral strip was dead ahead. If he was off by even a few degrees, they were headed for the trees or the jagged reefs. At 58, Smith threw the lever to extend the landing gear. 3 green lights flickered onto the panel, confirming the robust struts were locked and ready for the impact. But without a visual on the runway, he couldn't flare the aircraft properly. If he slammed into the coral too hard, the gear would collapse, and at over 100 mph, the Black Widow would disintegrate. The fuel gauge hit 7%, roughly 36 gallons left. Smith dropped full flaps, feeling the airframe lurch as the speed bled off to 110 knots. The Widow began to settle, descending at 300 feet per minute, 250 feet, 200, 150. Outside the glass, there was nothing but an infinite, suffocating black. Smith was flying by the numbers alone. At 100 feet, he throttled back. The rate of descent sharpened to 400 feet per minute, a risky, aggressive drop, but he needed the ground now. 75 feet, 50, 25. Smith braced, his hands white-knuckled on the yoke. At 59, the main wheels slammed into the crushed coral. The jolt echoed through the fuselage, a violent shudder that tested every rivet in the plane, but the gear held. 3 seconds later, the nose wheel dropped, and Smith stood on the brakes. The P-61 slowed through the darkness, 80 knots, 60, 40. When the aircraft finally crawled to a halt, Smith had no idea where on the strip he had landed. He just sat there in the silence, his fuel gauge resting at 6%, barely 3 minutes of life left in the tanks. Ground crews soon appeared, their flashlights cutting through the gloom like tiny beacons. They guided the exhausted hunter toward the parking revetments. At 103, exactly 63 minutes after he had roared into the night, Smith cut the engines. When Smith finally climbed out of the cockpit, his legs felt like lead and his hands were trembling, not from the adrenaline of the dogfights, but from the sheer weight of exhaustion. In just 63 minutes, he had navigated 5 intercepts, secured 5 kills, and executed a blind landing in total darkness. Porter emerged from the radar compartment shortly after. The night's success belonged to him as much as Smith. He had tracked every ghost on the scope, guided every vector, and maintained a lock through every evasive maneuver. In the world of night fighting, the pilot was the weapon, but the radar operator was the eyes. Without that perfect coordination, the P-61 would have been just another blind bird in the dark. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft with flashlights, but their inspection revealed a pristine machine. The Black Widow hadn't taken a single hit. Smith had started the night with 800 rounds of 20 ammunition and returned with 392. He had used only 408 shells to erase 5 enemy aircraft from the sky, an average of about 80 rounds per kill. He still had the teeth for 2 more fights, but his tanks were bone dry. By 115, the intelligence officers were on the scene, notebooks open. Smith recounted the mission from memory. 4 Betty bombers, 1 Helen, and the Nakajima Frank fighter, all destroyed in a frantic 49-minute window of engagement. The confirmation didn't take long. Ground-based radar had tracked the blips vanishing from the scope, and coastal observers had reported the distant, orange blooms of fire hitting the water. When the sun rose over the Philippines, the wreckage bobbing in the surf confirmed everything Smith had said. With 5 kills in a single night, Smith hadn't just protected the airfield. He had matched the record for the most successful night fighter mission in American history. But for Major Carroll Smith, the night's work was far from over. On December 30, 1944, at 14:30 hours, Smith was back in the air. The mission had shifted from hunting bombers to intercepting Japanese reconnaissance fighters that had been spotted prowling over Muro. These single-engine scouts were faster and far more elusive than the heavy bombers he had faced the night before. Smith and Porter took off in the same Black Widow, now fully replenished with 646 gallons of fuel and a fresh rack of 800 rounds. By 1512, Porter's scope picked up a signature. A contact 8 miles out, cruising at 12,000 feet. Smith began a hard climb. The target was another Nakajima Kiminus 84 Frank. While the Frank could outrun a P-61 in a level chase, Smith held the altitude advantage. He rolled into a steep dive, using gravity to push the Black Widow to a screaming 390 mph, outpacing the Frank's maximum speed. At 400 yards, he unleashed a 2-second burst. 48 rounds hammered into the Frank's engine, causing a massive explosion. The fighter flipped and plummeted into the sea. The legacy of the Black Widow, that victory, was Smith's 7th kill, officially making him the top-scoring American night fighter ace of World War II. He had achieved 7 confirmed victories in less than 24 hours of combat flying, a record that remained unmatched by any American night fighter pilot in any theater of the war. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron remained at Muro through January 1945, ending the war with 18 total kills, the highest of any P-61 unit in the Pacific. Incredibly, Smith's individual performance accounted for 39% of the entire squadron's score. For his indispensable role in the radar compartment, Lieutenant Philip Porter was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The P-61 that Smith flew continued its combat service through May 1945, surviving the war without a scratch. However, like most of the legendary Black Widows, it was scrapped after VJ Day. Today, only 4 P-61s remain in existence, and none of them are the aircraft that hunted 4 bombers in a single hour. The nose art and the kill markings are lost to time, but the impact of that night remains. Because Smith held the line, Meuire Field remained operational. When American forces landed at Lingayen Gulf on January 9, 1945, the P-51s and P-47s providing their air cover were flying from the very runways Smith had defended. Engineers later estimated that if the Japanese bombers had hit their targets, construction would have been delayed by at least 2 weeks, a delay that would have cost countless lives and extended the war. Major Carroll Smith survived the war, leaving behind a legacy of precision and courage in the darkest skies of the Pacific. In February 1946, Smith returned to the United States and transitioned into civilian life. He never sought the spotlight, never drafted a memoir, and never chased fame. Today, his incredible feats live only in the sterile lines of military archives, unit histories, and intelligence reports. The quiet, dry documentation of 5 kills in one night and a legacy of missions accomplished. The P-61 Black Widow stands as a testament to what a dedicated night fighter could achieve. With 700 units built, it dominated the night skies across every major theater, from Europe and the Mediterranean to China, Burma, and the Pacific. After the war, the aircraft was redesignated as the F-61 and remained in service until 1954, eventually stepping aside for the jet-powered interceptors of the Cold War. But in December 1944, over the dark canopy of Muro, the Black Widow was the most advanced Predator in the world, and Carroll Smith was the finest pilot ever to sit in its cockpit. If this story of late-night heroism moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Every like signals to YouTube that stories like this deserve to be told. Subscribe and turn on notifications to join us as we rescue forgotten history from dusty archives every single day. We're bringing you the stories of real people, real heroism, and the pilots who turned the tide of war with nothing but skill and a radar scope. Drop a comment right now and let us know where you're watching from. Whether you're tuning in from the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, or beyond, our community spans the globe. You aren't just a viewer, you're a guardian of these memories. Tell us your location or share if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that the name of Major Carroll Smith doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are the ones making that happen.